The lake always looked like glass in the mornings, catching the light before the world woke up. Rick Malone liked to sit out there before breakfast, coffee steaming in his hand, listening to the rhythm of sprinklers and the low hum of a distant mower. It wasn't fancy living, but it was peace. A quiet corner of Georgia suburbia where folks waved without words, and the loudest argument you'd hear was over which barbecue rub won last year's neighborhood cook-off. Rick liked that sort of small-scale predictability. After 22 years in the Navy and another 15 fixing everything from garage doors to washing machines, stillness was a kind of luxury. His house sat at the far edge of Pine Willow Estates, the last one before the tree line curved down toward the private lake that the HOA bragged about in every brochure. Lakefront serenity, the pamphlet had promised. Rick had bought it 5 years ago after losing his wife to cancer. He wanted water, quiet, and a place where the neighbors said good morning. For the most part, that's what he got. There was Carl, 2 doors down, who mowed in straight lines so crisp you could land a plane between them. There was old Mrs. Delaney, who walked her poodle in a pink sweater every day at exactly 7:30. And then there was Karen Pickett. Karen was the kind of woman who made clipboards nervous. She'd been the HOA secretary for nearly a decade and wore it like a badge of authority. She had a voice that carried, especially when she said things like, "It's in the bylaws," or, "We all need to respect community standards." Rick tried to stay out of her orbit. He didn't mind rules, he just liked when they made sense. That summer, the heat arrived early. The kind that made air shimmer over the asphalt and left you feeling like you were walking through soup. Rick had been patching his dock after a few planks gave out. The lake behind his property wasn't huge, maybe 30 yards across, but it was enough to keep him feeling connected to something natural. He'd built that dock himself with pressure-treated pine and stainless screws, the way he used to fix things on ships. Every evening, when the sun dipped low, he'd pull out his old red kayak, slide it into the water, and drift for 20 minutes. Sometimes he'd toss in a fishing line. Sometimes he'd just float and listen to the frogs. It was his ritual, his decompression chamber. One Thursday evening, he noticed movement up by the bank. Karen stood near the cattails in her visor and matching windbreaker, phone raised like a periscope. He waved, thinking she might be taking a picture of the sunset. She didn't wave back. Instead, she pointed at her watch, then scribbled something on a notepad before turning and marching off. Rick chuckled. Maybe she was logging bird sightings. He hoped the great blue heron got a mention. The next morning, while Rick buttered his toast, he heard the mail slot clatter. A single white envelope lay on the doormat, stamped with the HOA logo. He almost tossed it aside. It was usually a newsletter about repainting mailboxes or trimming hedges to uniform height, but something about the thick paper made him pause. He slid it open with his pocket knife and began to read. Notice of violation, Section 4.3, Unauthorized Aquatic Activity. Rick blinked. He read it again. You are hereby fined in the amount of $5,000 for violation of Community Rule 4.3 pertaining to unauthorized use of shared bodies of water. Continued offenses may result in legal action. Below, in bold, it said, Incident observed and recorded on May 12th at approximately 7:45 p.m. Signed, Karen Pickett, HOA Water Safety Chair. He set the toast down and stared at the letter. $5,000 for kayaking in the lake that bordered his property. He flipped the page over, looking for some kind of joke. Nothing. Just a return address and instructions for payment. He laughed once sharply. Then he laughed again because the alternative was throwing the letter into the toaster. By mid-morning, he walked over to Carl's house with the letter in hand. Carl squinted through his bifocals. $5,000? For floating? Rick nodded. Carl leaned on his mower and whistled. Buddy, that's new even for her. They both looked down at the lake, glinting peacefully like it had no idea it was now a crime scene. Rick decided to call the HOA office. After 5 rings, the voicemail kicked in. Thank you for contacting Pine Willow Estates Homeowners Association. Our office hours are Tuesday through Thursday, 9 to 3. Please leave a detailed message. He left one. Polite, calm, asking for clarification. When no one called back, he sent an email to the address on the letter. 2 hours later, he received a curt reply. See Section 4.3 of your HOA charter. Unauthorized aquatic activity is subject to fines to prevent liability. Karen. He dug out his folder of closing documents, looking for the HOA rules. The charter was 37 pages long, typed in 12-point Times New Roman and written like it had been translated from Latin. He skimmed through it until he found Section 4.3. It read, "No member shall engage in unapproved recreational or aquatic use of communal bodies of water without written authorization from the HOA board." He flipped to the appendix, looking for definitions. There weren't any. Communal bodies of water were never defined. Nor was unapproved use. Nor was authorization. The whole thing was as clear as mud. "So I'm trespassing on my own dock," he muttered. "Guess I should have asked myself for permission first." The next day, another letter arrived, same logo, same tone. Reminder: non-payment of HOA fines may result in lien against property. The fine hadn't even been due yet. Rick shook his head, muttering to the empty kitchen. They move faster on fines than they do on potholes. By the weekend, the story had already reached the neighborhood Facebook group. A post titled "Water Safety Reminder" featured a blurry picture of Rick in his kayak and a caption about enforcing community rules for everyone's safety. The comments split evenly between people laughing and people arguing over whether it was technically his property. One anonymous account just wrote, "Bet he peed in the lake." Rick closed the app and decided social media was best left to the birds. That Sunday, while trimming the hedges, he saw Karen walking her dog along the shoreline. He considered waving again but decided against it. She paused near his property line, looked down at his dock, and then kept walking, chin high. For the first time since he moved there, Rick felt unwelcome in his own yard. That night, sitting by the window, he stared out at the lake. The moonlight turned it silver, ripples catching on the reeds. He thought about his wife, how she used to tease him for reading instruction manuals for fun. "You and your fine print," she'd say. The memory made him smile and then frown. Maybe fine print was exactly what this situation needed. He went to his desk, pulled out the thick binder of HOA documents again, and laid them out like a mechanic preparing tools. There had to be something in there, some clause, some technicality, some leverage. Because if they wanted to play by the rules, he'd make sure they actually followed them. He poured another cup of coffee, settled in under the warm desk lamp, and started reading from page 1. Outside, the sprinklers clicked on, keeping rhythm like a metronome. Somewhere in the distance, a frog croaked. Rick underlined the first sentence that didn't make sense. Then the second. Then the third. By midnight, his binder was full of yellow highlights and sticky notes. The lake, silent and calm beyond the glass, reflected the glow of his lamp. He smiled slightly, feeling the first spark of something that wasn't anger. Something sharper, quieter, and far more effective. If they wanted to fine him for touching the water, maybe it was time to see how deep that water really went. And that letter, the one that started it all, still sat pinned on the fridge door, right next to the magnet that said, "Don't get mad, get even with receipts." By Monday morning, the absurdity had gone from a bad joke to neighborhood gossip. When Rick walked into the local hardware store, the clerk grinned and said, "Hey, you the guy who got fined for skinny dipping?" Rick raised an eyebrow. "Kayaking," he corrected. The clerk chuckled. "Doesn't matter. Around here, rumor adds 10 pounds and a margarita." Word had spread faster than crabgrass. Apparently, someone in the HOA Facebook group thought the story needed flair. By the time it reached the far end of Pine Willow Estates, Rick had supposedly built a tiki bar on the lake and was charging admission. He tried to laugh it off, but the irritation stuck to him like wet paint. When he got home, another email waited in his inbox. Reminder, fine payment due. It was from Karen, of course, with a scanned attachment of the same letter he'd already received. The subject line said, "Second notice," in all caps, like she was typing from a watchtower. He wrote back, "Dear Karen, could you please clarify how one obtains authorization for aquatic activity? 5 minutes later came the reply. Submit written request to the HOA board. Next meeting scheduled in 3 months. 3 months. Rick set his mug down and exhaled through his nose. Guess I'll hold my breath until then. The following weekend, he found a bright yellow paper taped to his front gate. It read, "Property under violation. Do not remove." It fluttered in the wind like a warning flag, and for a moment he just stared at it, incredulous. "What is this, quarantine for kayaks?" he muttered. He peeled it off and stuck it to his refrigerator next to the fine notice, right under his "Don't get mad, get even" magnet. The collection was starting to look like modern art. That evening, Carl stopped by with a beer. "Heard the board added a new item to the next HOA agenda," he said. "Something about aquatic risk management?" Rick laughed. "You mean me?" Carl nodded. "She's got half the board convinced you're a liability. I even heard she mentioned calling the county." Rick raised an eyebrow. "For what, illegal floating?" It would have been funny if it hadn't been so real. By Tuesday, another letter came, this one marked urgent. Inside was a formal threat of lien if he didn't pay within 15 days. There was a sentence about protecting the community's collective property interests. Rick couldn't help muttering, protecting them from what? Peace and quiet? That night, while scrolling through his phone, he saw Karen's latest post in the HOA Facebook group, a grainy photo of him, taken from across the water. The caption read, "We all love our lake, but please remember, safety rules exist for a reason." The comment section was a battlefield. Half the neighbors rolled their eyes with laughing emojis. The other half applauded her dedication to order. One user wrote, "He's setting a bad example." Another asked, "Isn't he a veteran? Thought they knew about following rules." Rick closed the app and poured himself a small glass of bourbon. He took one slow sip and looked out at the moonlit water. The same lake that had been his peace now glowed like an accusation. He wasn't an angry man by nature, but something about the smug tone in those letters, the self-importance of it all, started to burn under his skin. Still, he knew better than to react in anger. You don't fight a bureaucrat with emotion. You fight with precision. The next morning, he printed out the entire HOA charter. All 37 pages of fine print. He highlighted the section about aquatic activity, then read the sections before and after it. The language was so vague it could have outlawed rain. There was no mention of boundaries, ownership, or what even counted as use. More interestingly, there was a line in section 12.2 about shared maintenance obligations for common areas, including the lake. It said all homeowners shared equal ownership of common spaces and therefore had voting rights in their management. Rick leaned back in his chair, tapping the pen against his chin. "Shared ownership," he murmured. "So technically, I'm part of management." He decided to check his property deed just to be sure. The survey map showed his lot extending 15 feet into the lake. That meant the section of water he'd been fined for using wasn't common at all. It was legally his. He smiled. For the first time in days, the irritation cracked into something lighter. Not joy exactly, but satisfaction. That afternoon, he sent another email to Karen. "Dear HOA Board, as per my property deed, I appear to own a section of Pine Willow Lake extending approximately 15 feet beyond my dock. Please confirm that this portion falls under my individual property rights. Sincerely, Rick Malone." The reply came that evening. "Your interpretation is incorrect. The entire lake is under HOA jurisdiction." No signature this time, just board management. Rick chuckled. "So we've gone from Karen to we. Guess I'm climbing the ladder." Later that week, while mowing his lawn, he noticed 2 HOA volunteers standing near the waterline, clipboards in hand. They wore matching polo shirts that said, "Community Safety Patrol." One of them took photos of the dock while the other measured something with a tape reel. Rick walked over. "Morning. You boys lost." The taller one cleared his throat. "Routine inspection. Part of the new safety initiative." Rick gestured at the water. "Safety from what, turtles?" The man didn't answer, just jotted something down. When they left, Rick could hear them muttering about documentation. That night, Carl called. "They're out of control, buddy. Heard they fined someone else for leaving a garden hose visible from the street." Rick laughed until he almost spilled his drink. Guess we're all one misplaced hose away from bankruptcy. Still, the situation wasn't funny anymore. The HOA had turned a quiet community into a playground for paranoia. Neighbors who used to wave now looked the other way, unsure whose side they were on. A few even whispered that Rick was starting trouble. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd done nothing but float. The next HOA newsletter landed in everyone's mailbox the following Monday. Front and center, under Community Updates, was a paragraph titled Water Safety Reminder. It began, "Recent incidents have reminded us why rules exist. Unauthorized use of the lake endangers all residents and could result in increased insurance costs." The last line read, "We thank everyone for their cooperation and their compliance." Rick read it twice, then poured another coffee. "They're really trying to make me the villain," he said to himself. The part that stung most wasn't the fine. It was the insinuation that he was reckless, that he'd somehow endangered anyone. He'd spent his life following rules that mattered. Safety protocols, equipment checks, responsibility. The idea that a petty committee thought they knew better was laughable, if it hadn't been so insulting. That evening, he found a small crowd gathered at the lake. Karen stood in front, clipboard ready, giving what looked like a safety lecture. "We need to be vigilant," she was saying. "Accidents can happen anytime." Rick leaned against his fence, arms folded. A neighbor whispered something and chuckled. Karen noticed him and stiffened. "And that's why we have to enforce the rules, no exceptions." She glanced directly at him. Rick smiled and tipped his hat. She turned away. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Delaney stopped by his gate. "Don't let her get to you, dear," she said softly. "She fined me last year for hanging wind chimes. Said they were a noise hazard." Rick laughed. "What did you do?" She winked. "Hung up 2 more. When the sun went down, he went back to his desk. The binder of bylaws sat open, pages covered in notes and sticky tabs. He'd underlined words like quorum, budget transparency, and board elections. There were gaps everywhere, rules written without follow-through, responsibilities the board hadn't met. He noticed one clause that made him pause. Asterisk, annual financial disclosures must be made available to all members upon request. Asterisk, he'd never seen one. A plan began to form, slow and deliberate, like an engine starting in cold weather. If they wanted to play lawyer, he could play auditor. Not out of revenge exactly, but fairness. Every time Karen had said, "It's in the bylaws," she was right. But maybe she didn't realize those same bylaws worked both ways. By midnight, he had a list, questions, requests, motions. The fine had started as a nuisance, but now it was a blueprint. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was about to turn their own rules into his best tool. And if he played it right, that lake would do more than reflect the sunset. It would reflect their mistakes. He leaned back, satisfied, and looked toward the window. The moon sat low over the water, its reflection rippling softly. Somewhere out there, a frog croaked, oblivious to the paperwork war about to begin. Rick smiled faintly. "If they think $5,000 was bold," he muttered. "Wait till they see the bill I send next." The next morning began the way most of Rick's days did. Coffee, silence, and the sound of sprinklers clicking like slow applause. But that day, the rhythm had a new undertone. He'd slept maybe 4 hours, head full of clauses and subclauses. Somewhere around 2 a.m., it hit him. The HOA wasn't just wrong morally, they were wrong legally. The rules they loved to quote hadn't been properly enforced or even filed in years. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to argue. He just needed to make their own rulebook work against them. He opened his laptop and began drafting an email with the subject line, "Request for HOA financial disclosures, per section 9.4 of Charter." It was short, polite, and direct. He hit send. 10 minutes later, he got the automatic "thank you for your inquiry" reply, one of those generic responses that might as well say, "You'll never hear from us again." Fine, he thought. Paper trails are patient. That afternoon, He walked over to Carl's house with a notebook in hand. Carl was kneeling beside his flower beds, trimming his roses like they were an endangered species. "You ever seen an HOA financial report?" Rick asked. Carl laughed. "I didn't even know we had finances. I thought Karen ran the place on pure oxygen and caffeine." Rick smirked. "Turns out they're supposed to file a financial disclosure every year." Carl blinked. "Every year? I've lived here 10. "Exactly." They stood there a moment, the absurdity sinking in. Carl shook his head. "So what are you gonna do?" Rick shrugged. "Ask nicely. Then ask again less nicely, but still polite." That night, he printed a petition form, simple wording at the top. "We, the undersigned, request a special homeowners meeting to review compliance with community financial and operational bylaws." It sounded bureaucratic enough to be unthreatening, but sharp enough to make anyone reading it sweat a little. He started walking door to door the next day. Some neighbors hesitated at first. Most folks were wary of being on record against the HOA. But once he explained that the board hadn't filed disclosures, hadn't updated safety insurance, and possibly spent community funds without approval, signatures came faster. "I'm not against rules," Rick said to each one. "I'm against bad bookkeeping dressed up as rules." By sunset, he had 15 names. By the weekend, 33. Out of 50 homes, that was more than half the neighborhood. Enough to force a meeting under the charter's own terms. Karen must have gotten wind of it because the next morning he received a terse email titled, "Cease and Desist Unauthorized Petition." It read, "Your actions are disruptive to the harmony of Pine Willow Estates. The board reserves the right to pursue legal recourse." He read it 3 times and smiled. Harmony, he thought. That was rich coming from the woman who fined him for kayaking. He printed the email and stapled it to the front of his growing binder. "Evidence, Exhibit B," he muttered. A few hours later, she doubled down with a community-wide post. "Asterisk, please disregard any rumors of a special meeting. The board is managing all community matters appropriately." Asterisk, the comments, however, didn't go as planned. One neighbor asked, "Then where's last year's budget?" Another wrote, "Wait, what meeting?" Within an hour, the post vanished. Rick wasn't even mad anymore. Watching her try to contain the story was better than any sitcom. He sent his official request for the meeting emailed, mailed, and hand-delivered. According to Section 7.2, the board had 10 days to respond. On day 11, he received a single-page notice taped to his mailbox. Special meeting, Monday, 6 p.m. at Community Hall. No signature, no details. But it was enough. Carl helped him carry a box of binders to the hall that evening. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed over rows of metal folding chairs. The smell of burnt coffee filled the air. Karen sat at the front table, posture so rigid she looked vacuum-sealed. 2 other board members flanked her, both staring at their hands like they'd rather be anywhere else. Neighbors filed in, murmuring. Someone whispered, "Is this about the kayak guy?" Another replied, "I heard it's about money." The buzz grew. Rick took a seat in the second row, his binder balanced on his knee. Karen tapped the microphone. "All right, let's begin. First item, unauthorized distribution of misleading petitions." Rick raised his hand. "Before we start, can we get a copy of the last financial disclosure? The bylaws require it." Karen froze for half a second before recovering. "Those documents are internal." Rick smiled. Section 9.4. All members may request access to financial records upon written request. I submitted that last week. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She pressed her lips together. "We'll release summaries after internal review." "After 3 years?" he asked calmly. That did it. A few chuckles broke out. Carl whispered, "Got her." Karen's jaw tightened. "Mr. Malone, this meeting was not called to discuss administrative delays." "No," Rick said, standing up slowly. "It was called to ensure compliance, and I think everyone here deserves to know how their fees are being spent." The murmurs became a low rumble. One woman in the back shouted, "Where's our maintenance fund?" You promised dock repairs last year. Karen's smile stretched thin. Please, everyone, let's maintain order. Rick opened his binder, flipping through tabs. I went through the budget line items from 3 years ago. There's a community improvement fund listed at $15,000. Any updates on that? She didn't answer. How about the beautification initiative? 10 grand for that? Her eyes flicked toward the treasurer, who stared at the table. Rick didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence did the work for him. See, I don't mind paying dues. But if you're going to fine me for touching water I partially own, I'd like to make sure that water isn't also paying for somebody's backyard fountain. Laughter burst through the room. Even the treasurer cracked a smile. Karen slammed the gavel. Order. Of course, Rick said politely, closing his binder. Order is what we're all here for. She called a 5-minute recess, practically sprinting to the back room with her board. Rick leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and whispered to Carl. That went well. Carl grinned. You're officially the most dangerous man with a highlighter in Georgia. When they returned, Karen's tone had shifted from defiant to brittle. The board will schedule a follow-up meeting to provide documentation. In the meantime, please refrain from spreading unverified information. Rick nodded, looking forward to it. After the meeting, 6 neighbors stopped him in the parking lot. About time someone stood up to them, one said. Another added, they've been overcharging for years. The air buzzed with gossip and vindication. For the first time in months, Rick felt like the current was flowing his way. Back home, he sat on his porch watching the sun set over the lake. The surface rippled gold and orange, perfectly calm. He could hear Karen's voice echoing faintly from down the street, probably on another phone call trying to contain the damage. He didn't envy her. Paperwork was an unrelenting opponent. It never shouted, never slept, and it always left a trail. He flipped through his binder one more time, adding a sticky note to the page about budget reallocation. There was another clause, Section 8.7, stating that any homeowner could propose amendments or new budget items at the next official meeting with majority support. That was the key. If he could get enough neighbors to vote, he could redirect the HOA's own money. Not to punish, but to protect the lake, to fund maintenance, to remind everyone what community actually meant. The idea settled in his mind, neat and satisfying. Raise the dues, redirect the funds, rebuild the dock. Legally, cleanly, perfectly by the book. And all of it signed off by the same board that tried to drown him in red tape. As twilight deepened, a heron glided across the water, wings wide, effortless. Rick smiled faintly. The plan was forming step by quiet step. He'd fight this battle the same way he used to fix engines. Slowly, precisely, with no wasted motion. He didn't need to shout across the water. He just needed to turn the screws in silence until the whole machine clicked into place. He stood, stretched, and took one last look at the letter still pinned on his fridge inside. The fine that started it all looked almost harmless now, like a bad first draft of a much better story. They had no idea what was coming, he said softly, and the lake, still as a mirror, seemed to agree. The following Monday arrived humid and heavy, the kind of Georgia day where even the air felt opinionated. Rick buttoned a clean shirt, tucked in his notes, and headed toward the community hall for what was being called an extraordinary HOA assembly. The word extraordinary made him laugh. Nothing about the HOA was ever extraordinary, except maybe their creativity in finding new ways to irritate people. But this one felt different. Neighbors were buzzing, curious, suspicious. The whispers on the Nextdoor app had already turned the meeting into a small-town spectacle. By 5:30, the parking lot was half full. A handful of residents leaned against their cars, chatting in hushed tones. You think she'll show the books? One man asked. Not a chance, said another. She'll probably call it classified. Rick walked by them with a polite nod. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here to keep things calm, factual, surgical. You don't gut a fish by swinging wildly, you do it with clean cuts. Inside, the hall buzzed with low conversation. The usual smell of stale coffee mixed with cheap powdered donuts filled the air. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table with 3 nameplates. Karen Pickett, chair, David Klein, treasurer, and Lisa Morales, a vice president. Karen sat in the center like a monarch guarding her throne, perfectly coiffed, lips tight enough to cut paper. Rick took a seat near the middle. He wanted to be close enough to speak but far enough to watch. A neighbor leaned over and whispered, "Heard she brought a lawyer." Rick glanced at the end of the table and saw a man in a gray suit setting down a briefcase. "Figures," Rick murmured. "When the facts don't help you, buy some volume." At 6 sharp, Karen tapped the microphone. "Order, please." The room quieted, except for the creak of metal chairs. "We're here to address recent confusion surrounding community finances and property policies. The board would like to clarify misinformation that's been spreading." Rick leaned back, arms crossed, waiting. Karen continued, "We have consulted legal counsel, and all financial records are in compliance with standard HOA procedure." She gestured toward the lawyer, who gave a solemn nod that said absolutely nothing. Rick raised his hand. "Will you be presenting the actual records tonight?" Karen frowned. "This is not the proper forum for that discussion." "Then which one is?" he asked evenly. "The bylaws say members can review records at any regular meeting." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The lawyer cleared his throat. "We'll be providing summaries when appropriate." Rick smiled slightly. "Summaries aren't the same as records." Karen's knuckles whitened around the microphone. "Mr. Malone, continual interruptions will not be tolerated." He nodded. "Understood. I just wanted to make sure we're all following Section 9.4 correctly." Someone in the back laughed. Another clapped quietly before catching himself. Karen shot them a glare. Rick could feel the tide turning. People who'd been afraid to speak were starting to realize she wasn't as untouchable as she thought. He didn't need to grandstand. He just needed to keep asking reasonable questions until the unreasonable ran out of patience. The treasurer, David, finally spoke up. "We, don't have those reports printed tonight." Rick replied, "No problem. I brought a printer." That earned him a few chuckles. Karen tried to regain control. "Moving on to community safety initiatives." But someone else interrupted. "Wait, what about the $15,000 for lake maintenance last year?" Another resident asked. "Where'd that go?" Karen's tone sharpened. "Maintenance expenses are ongoing." "Then why's the dock still broken?" a voice shouted from the back. The meeting dissolved into overlapping questions. Karen banged the gavel repeatedly, each thud like a desperate heartbeat. "Order! Order!" The sound didn't quiet them, it fueled them. The lawyer leaned over, whispering something to her. She nodded stiffly and said, "Due to disruptive behavior, this meeting is adjourned." That was when Rick stood up. "Before you end it, one thing. We all pay the same dues. We deserve the same respect. If the rules apply to me on the lake, they apply to you in this room." It was calm, quiet, surgical, and it landed like a hammer. Karen froze, the gavel midair. She glared at him for a long beat, then muttered, "Fine. You want records? You'll get them." She slammed the gavel once more and stormed off stage. The crowd buzzed with low laughter and murmured disbelief. People lingered even after the board fled, talking in small clusters. Rick shook hands, exchanged a few nods. The battle wasn't over, but the ground had shifted. By the next morning, the neighborhood Facebook group had exploded. Someone had recorded the whole exchange on their phone, and within hours the clip had hundreds of comments. The title, *HOA chair loses it over simple question. The comment section was a buffet of catharsis. "About time someone called her out," wrote one. Another said, "She fined me for leaving a holiday wreath up too long. Good for this guy." Karen must have seen it, because 2 hours later, she emailed everyone a statement. "Unauthorized video recordings of HOA meetings are prohibited and may result in disciplinary action." Rick couldn't help but chuckle. "Disciplinary action," he muttered. "She's really leaning into that dictatorship thing." Still, he wasn't gloating. He knew how people like Karen worked. When they lost control publicly, they didn't surrender, they doubled down privately. He printed the entire thread of comments and emails, added them to his binder, and waited. The retaliation came faster than he expected. 2 days later, a new envelope appeared on his door. Notice of defamation concern. It accused him of spreading misleading information and harming community reputation. The signature line simply read, HOA Legal Counsel. Rick held it up to the light. The paper looked expensive. He laughed. Guess my kayak's making waves again. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, he walked down to his dock. The lake was calm, mirroring the orange sky. He sat on the edge, binder beside him, flipping through pages. He wasn't worried about their threats. Everything he'd done was within the rules. Documented, dated, polite. Bureaucracy was slow, but it favored the meticulous. Then his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Asterisk, you didn't hear it from me, but check the HOA Dropbox folder. Folder name, Finances_2021. Asterisk. He frowned, curiosity piqued. Back inside, he opened his laptop and followed the link. The folder was full of spreadsheets, scans of receipts, contractor payments, itemized lists, and one file labeled lake_improvement_expenses.pdf. When he opened it, he froze. There it was. $10,000 paid to Pickett Landscaping Services. The note read, Beautification Project, Phase 1. He scrolled further. Payments for mulch, lighting, stone fixtures, all matching the photos Karen had posted last year of her newly landscaped backyard. Rick leaned back, exhaling slowly. It wasn't just mismanagement anymore, it was misuse. He printed the file immediately and tucked it into his binder under a new tab labeled Evidence. He didn't send angry emails, didn't post online. He just waited. He knew better than to strike before the moment mattered. By Friday, the board called for an emergency executive session at the clubhouse. Members only, closed to residents. Rick showed up anyway, copy of the bylaws under his arm. Karen met him at the door, jaw tight. This meeting isn't open to you. Actually, he said, flipping to section 10.2. It is. Any member in good standing can attend, and my dues are fully paid. Even the ones you tried to add. The lawyer inside sighed audibly. Let him in. Rick sat in the back, quiet. He didn't speak until they tried to vote on new communication rules, banning the distribution of unapproved documents. Excuse me, he said, raising his hand. Before you vote, you might want to disclose that your landscaping company received $10,000 from HOA funds last year. The room fell silent. Karen's pen clattered against the table. Her face drained of color. Those were approved expenses, she stammered. Rick handed her a printed page. By who? Because there's no record of a vote. And according to section 9.8, personal businesses of board members must be disclosed in writing. You didn't file that either. Her voice cracked. Where did you get this? He shrugged. Public records are public. The lawyer leaned toward her, whispering rapidly. She nodded, trembling slightly, then said, This meeting is adjourned. Rick stood slowly, collecting his binder. Sure thing. Just make sure to include that in the minutes. He walked out into the evening air, feeling the weight lift off his chest. The sun was fading, the cicadas starting up, and somewhere in the distance, sprinklers hissed. He paused at the edge of the parking lot, smiling faintly. At this point, he murmured to himself, I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. He glanced back once. Through the clubhouse window, he could see Karen still sitting at the table, head in her hands. Then he walked home, the lake reflecting the last bits of daylight. Tomorrow, he'd file a motion to reallocate the HOA budget, and he had every legal right to do it. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. He opened his door, set the binder on the counter, and looked at the fine notice still pinned to the fridge. He grinned. Funny, he said softly, how $5,000 can end up costing someone a whole lot more. And the next morning, Sure enough, another letter arrived, short, stiff, and full of regret. Notice of special election. The kind of letter that meant the walls were finally starting to crack. 2 weeks after the emergency session, Pine Willow Estates looked the same from the outside. Green lawns, neat hedges, the hum of lawnmowers. But underneath, the ground had shifted. People waved at Rick now, not out of courtesy but quiet gratitude. Someone even left a six-pack on his porch with a note. Asterisk for services rendered to the neighborhood republic. Asterisk. He smiled, shaking his head. Guess I'm a local hero, he muttered. Karen, on the other hand, had vanished from sight. The HOA's Facebook page, once a daily sermon of bylaws and reminders, sat eerily silent. Her dog still barked at 6 a.m., but Karen herself hadn't been seen since the defamation letter flopped. Rick knew she was regrouping. Petty power never disappeared. It just changed tactics. And he was ready. He spent the next few evenings going through his binder, fine-tuning a motion he'd drafted. Reallocation of community budget for lake safety and infrastructure. It sounded bland enough, but every word had teeth. If passed, it would legally divert funds away from Karen's pet projects and raise dues for board members who'd mismanaged money, specifically $10,000 each to cover new, mandatory safety compliance. The beauty of it was that it didn't target her personally. It targeted her position. The policy didn't say Karen pays 10 grand. It said, all board members found non-compliant with Section 9.8 contribute additional funds for remediation. In other words, she'd written her own invoice. On the morning of the vote, Rick ironed his shirt, checked his speech, and tucked the motion into a folder marked Transparency. The irony wasn't lost on him. The air outside was thick and wet, cicadas already screaming like gossipers who couldn't wait for the meeting to start. By the time he arrived, the community hall was overflowing. Folding chairs ran out. People stood along the walls. The treasurer, David, sat at the front table looking like a man who hadn't slept. Karen was there too, composed but pale. Her smile stretched thin enough to show tension lines. Rick sat quietly in the third row, binder in his lap. The room buzzed with expectation. Karen cleared her throat into the microphone. Thank you all for attending this special meeting. We're here to discuss community budget adjustments and ensure proper governance moving forward. She made it sound noble. Rick almost admired her nerve. She continued, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that certain misunderstandings have caused unrest in our community. Rest assured, your board remains committed to transparency. Someone in the back whispered, define transparency. A ripple of laughter followed. Karen shot a glare toward the noise, then forced a smile. We'll open the floor shortly, but first, the treasurer has a few words. David stood, fumbling with his papers. After reviewing recent financial reports, we found some discrepancies in record-keeping. Nothing malicious, just oversight. Rick raised an eyebrow. $10,000 worth of oversight? David froze halfway through his sentence. The room went still. Karen snapped. Mr. Malone, please wait your turn. He nodded. Of course. I just thought the number might help him jog his memory. A few quiet snickers broke the silence. Karen pressed on. Moving forward, the board proposes a small increase in annual dues to offset recent administrative costs. Rick took that as his cue. He stood, smooth and calm. Actually, I have a counterproposal already filed in accordance with Section 8.7. She blinked, visibly startled. You what? He handed a copy to the secretary, then turned to face the crowd. It's simple. Given recent issues with transparency and mismanagement, I propose a reallocation of funds, specifically a lake safety and accountability budget. The funds will go toward dock repairs, signage, and proper maintenance, with mandatory contributions from any board members who failed to meet disclosure requirements. The room erupted into murmurs. Karen grabbed the microphone. That's absurd. You can't single out board members like that. I'm not, he said smoothly. The clause applies to anyone found in violation. If the shoe fits. Her face reddened. You're exploiting a loophole. Rick smiled faintly. No, I'm respecting one. The lawyer, seated at the end of the table, cleared his throat. Technically, Mr. Malone is correct. His proposal is lawful and properly submitted. If the community votes in favor, it becomes binding. Karen turned on him, whispering furiously, but the damage was done. The crowd leaned forward, the energy shifting toward amusement. Rick could feel it, the sense of long-suppressed irritation finding an outlet. A neighbor raised her hand. So, to be clear, this would mean those who broke the rules pay extra to fix what they broke? Exactly, Rick said. Seems fair, doesn't it? The woman nodded. I'll second that motion. Karen pounded the gavel. This meeting is descending into chaos. Actually, Rick said, glancing at the lawyer, it's following procedure. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Motion seconded. All in favor. Hands shot up across the room. At least 2/3 of the crowd. The lawyer counted, nodded, and said, motion passes. The hall erupted in applause and laughter. Someone even whistled. Rick stayed still, arms crossed, watching Karen's face drain of color. She looked like a queen dethroned mid-speech. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply said, thank you all. I'll coordinate with the treasurer to ensure proper allocation. Karen tried one last attempt at dignity. You're making a mockery of community order. Rick shrugged. Just making it balanced. He packed his papers and turned to leave. As he passed her table, she muttered, you'll regret this. He smiled. Maybe, but I'll enjoy every invoice along the way. By evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. Carl stopped by with burgers and 2 cold beers. You did it, he said, handing one over. You actually beat her at her own game. Rick chuckled. I didn't beat her. She just ran out of rulebook. They sat on the dock, watching the sun bleed into the lake. The air smelled like rain and victory. The following week, the first official notice went out from the treasurer's office. Asterisk effective immediately. HOA board members are required to contribute additional funds for lake safety compliance. Asterisk Karen's name appeared at the top of the list, her special assessment totaling $10,000. Rick taped the letter to his fridge, right next to the original fine notice. Perfect symmetry. Within days, the funds covered new dock planks, life rings, and even a little wooden bench he installed himself. He painted a sign over it that read, asterisk, authorized aquatic activity area. Asterisk, it was both a victory lap and a monument to common sense. Neighbors started using the lake again. Kayaks, floaties, fishing rods. It felt like Pine Willow had exhaled. The tension that used to hover in the air dissolved into laughter and gossip about next month's barbecue. Then one morning, Rick looked out the window and saw Karen walking her dog along the path. She paused by the water, staring at the new dock. For a moment, she looked almost human, small, uncertain. Rick lifted his coffee mug in a silent toast. She didn't wave back, but she didn't look away either. Carl called later that day. You see her? Yeah, Rick said. Looks like she finally ran out of fines to write. Carl laughed. Bet she's writing a resignation letter instead. He wasn't far off. The official notice came 2 weeks later. Asterisk effective immediately. Karen Pickett has resigned from her position as HOA chair due to personal reasons. Asterisk, the letter was signed by the vice president, who added a small handwritten note at the bottom. Asterisk, thank you for restoring sanity. Asterisk. Rick chuckled softly when he read it. Sanity, he said aloud, sipping his coffee. That's a start. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he took one last walk to the dock. The water shimmered like melted glass. He ran a hand over the new wood, solid and smooth. The sign caught the fading light just right. Authorized aquatic activity area. He smiled, shaking his head. They fined me for swimming, he said quietly, and ended up funding my dock. The sound of distant sprinklers filled the silence. Rhythmic, familiar, peaceful. The neighborhood had gone back to being what it was meant to be. A place where people lived, not ruled. And for the first time in months, Rick felt the old calm return. the kind you can't fine or legislate. Behind him, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a soft glow across the water. He looked out one last time, content. Justice didn't always need a gavel. Sometimes, it just needed a man with patience, paperwork, and a well-timed smile. Morning light came soft and slow over Pine Willow Lake, glinting off the water that had once been a battlefield of petty bureaucracy. The air smelled of wet grass and coffee, and the only sounds were the ducks arguing and the faint drone of a lawn mower somewhere up the hill. Rick sat on his porch, a steaming mug in hand, watching ripples spread across the lake he had, in a roundabout way, reclaimed. The dock stood sturdy now, new planks, bright varnish, the words Authorized Aquatic Activity Area, painted proudly in black letters. Every time the sun hit those words, it reminded him that sometimes the best revenge wasn't loud or cruel. It was tidy, legal, and perfectly symmetrical. Word of the dock saga, as Carl called it, had spread far beyond Pine Willow. Rick didn't know who first uploaded the HOA meeting video to YouTube, but somehow it caught fire. Veteran outsmarts HOA was the headline on half a dozen local news pages. The comments section turned into a confessional booth of suburban misery. People wrote about being fined for mailbox colors, for Christmas lights left up too long, for lawns that grew half an inch too tall. One comment said, "Rick gives me hope. He didn't yell, didn't fight, he just outsmarted them." Rick didn't respond, but he read every one. The neighborhood, once a quiet field of passive-aggressive smiles, felt lighter now. The new HOA board was elected 3 members, all regular folks who actually showed up with notebooks instead of clipboards. The first thing they did was scrap half the pointless rules Karen had loved. The second was to host a community day, by the lake, complete with hot dogs, homemade lemonade, and a raffle for a free kayak. When they asked Rick to cut the ribbon, he almost refused. He wasn't one for ceremonies. But Carl pushed him forward, grinning. "Come on, Captain. You earned it." Rick walked to the dock that morning under a banner that said asterisk, "Welcome to Pine Willow, where rules don't rule people." Asterisk. The crowd clapped as he cut the ribbon with an oversized pair of scissors someone had borrowed from the craft store. "All right," he said dryly. "Let's keep the aquatic activities authorized this time." Laughter rippled through the group. For the first time in a long time, the lake echoed with joy instead of arguments. Later that afternoon, he sat with Mrs. Delaney under a pop-up tent eating hot dogs off paper plates. She wore a wide hat and kept laughing every few minutes for no clear reason. "You know, dear," she said, "you didn't just fix the lake, you fixed the neighborhood." Rick smiled. "All I did was read the fine print." She patted his arm. "Exactly. Most people don't bother. You did." He didn't say it aloud, but he knew what she meant. It wasn't about the lake or even the fines. It was about people remembering they weren't powerless. That quiet mattered. In the military, he'd learned that you don't win wars by shouting. You win them by keeping your head clear while everyone else loses theirs. As the sun dipped low, he walked the shoreline, beer in hand, nodding to neighbors who waved. The evening chorus of sprinklers began again, the sound that had always meant normal life here. For months, those sprinklers had felt like ticking clocks, counting down to another conflict. Now they just sounded like peace. Carl joined him on the dock, holding 2 burgers wrapped in foil. "Can't believe you didn't frame that fine notice," he said. Rick smirked. "It's still on the fridge. Reminds me how expensive stupidity can be." Carl laughed. "You're a legend, man. Folks still bring up your line from the meeting. What was it again?" Rick grinned faintly. "The rules apply to you in this room as much as they apply to me on the lake." "Yeah," Carl said, opening his burger. She hated that. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the reflection of porch lights shimmer on the water. Somewhere across the lake, someone started playing a slow country song on a portable speaker. Something about coming home and standing your ground. To fit. When the song ended, Carl leaned back. "You ever think she'll come around? Karen, I mean." Rick shrugged. "Maybe, but she doesn't have to. I don't need an apology to move on." Carl nodded. "That's annoyingly wise." Rick chuckled. "Getting older's not all bad." You just run out of energy for dumb battles. The next morning, he noticed something new. A small envelope taped to the base of his mailbox. No HOA logo, no threats, just his name in careful handwriting. Inside was a short note. *Rick. I wanted to say you were right. I got lost in the rules and forgot the people behind them. The lake looks beautiful. Take care of it. Karen. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded it neatly and slipped it into his binder. The same one that once held every petty letter, every citation, every weapon in his quiet war. It felt fitting that the last page of that story was an apology written in ink instead of printed on HOA letterhead. That weekend, he hosted his own small gathering. Nothing official, just a grill, some folding chairs, a cooler, and the smell of charcoal in the air. Neighbors drifted in and out, bringing side dishes and laughter. Mrs. Delaney made her famous potato salad. Carl handled the music, and even the new HOA president dropped by with a jug of sweet tea. At sunset, the conversation turned to life before all this nonsense. Someone asked what made him finally fight back. Rick thought for a moment before answering. I guess it's because they tried to take something small but meaningful, my peace. And I realized if you let people take the small things, they'll think they own the big ones too. The group nodded. It was the kind of truth that didn't need elaboration. As twilight settled in, he looked across the water. The new dock light glowed softly, its reflection stretching long and gold across the surface. A few kids skipped stones near the edge, and the sound of each splash echoed like punctuation marks in a sentence that finally made sense. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not the chest-thumping kind, but the warm, steady kind that lives behind a half-smile. He'd learned something about neighbors, about patience, about the strange power of paperwork. Most of all, he'd learned that politeness could be sharper than any weapon if you used it with precision. When the crowd started packing up, Mrs. Delaney squeezed his shoulder. So what now, Mr. Lake Legend? He grinned. Same thing as before. Coffee at sunrise. Maybe some fishing. And if I'm feeling rebellious. Don't say it, Carl warned with mock severity. Rick raised an eyebrow. I might go for a swim. They laughed until the crickets drowned them out. That night, when everyone had gone home, he stood alone on the dock. The air was still, the lake calm. He dipped his toes into the cool water, just because he could. Unauthorized aquatic activity, he whispered, smiling. Consider it very authorized. The moon reflected perfectly in the water, a silver coin resting on glass. He thought about how small the whole ordeal would look from up there, from above the roofs and lawns and bylaws. Just one man, one lake, and a community that learned humility the hard way. Maybe that was the real victory, that people finally remembered what mattered more than rules. He looked back toward his porch, the light spilling through the screen door. Everything felt simple again. Ordinary. Exactly how he liked it. The next morning, he woke early and brewed a pot of coffee. As the first light stretched across the yard, he sat in his usual chair and watched a heron glide low over the water. The world felt right again, and that was all the reward he needed. He took a slow sip and said to no one in particular, So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine, remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it. Then he smiled, leaned back, and listened to the sprinklers start up, the soundtrack of peace returning home.